2. Personal union between monopolies and governments of bourgeois countries. The subordination of the bourgeois state's apparatus to monopolies is a gradual process that becomes more apparent as monopolies' economic power and political influence grow. This subordination occurs through intense struggles between different bourgeois factions and monopoly groups. Lenin noted that bureaucratic positions and major posts are divided among representatives of bourgeois parties, reflecting the redistribution of power within the ruling class. A key form of subordination is the personal union between monopolies and bourgeois governments, which manifests in three main forms. Government representatives joining boards of monopolistic associations. Monopoly agents infiltrating state power. Monopolists themselves entering state power. Lenin, in his work Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, references German economist Edels, highlighting personal connections between capitalist monopoly leaders and government officials. In England, notable government officials were shareholders or directors in military equipment enterprises, spanning conservative and liberal parties. Instances occur where officials transition from civil service to monopolies, as seen with the German official Felker and Russian figures like Davidov, Timirazev, and A.I. Vishnegradsky. Lenin observed the close ties between czarist and provisional governments and monopoly leaders. In Banks and Ministers, Lenin highlighted how former ministers became bank council members, emphasizing the fluid movement between banking and ministerial roles. Lenin questioned the involvement of current ministers in banks, suggesting a deep integration between the state and monopolies. Monopoly capitalism and government involvement. In the era of monopoly capitalism, government officials increasingly participate in the boards and supervisory boards of large companies. Albert M. Martin noted in 1931 that many French senators and deputies held senior positions in major banks and companies. Simon Haxey highlighted that members of parliament were often found on the boards of English banks, like the Bank of England and Midland Bank. Fascist Italy. In 1932, many Italian senators and deputies held paid positions in monopolies, including electrical, sugar, insurance, engineering, chemical, and textile industries. France's billionaire trusts. High-ranking government officials often transitioned into private industry roles, leading to moral and political corruption. Monopoly government links. Officials on boards serve as links between monopolies and government. Direct penetration of monopolists into state apparatus is sought alongside personal union. Pressure groups and lobbyists. Pressure groups, or backroom groups, influence parliament and government, shaping public opinion and lobbying for monopoly interests. American lobbyists are central figures, engaging in bribery and influence to push favorable legislation. Lobbyists as invisible government. Lobbyists are called the invisible government, with significant influence in Washington, D.C., and other states. They represent industries and exert pressure on legislative members to vote in line with monopoly interests. Lobbying as big business. Lobbying has evolved into a multimillion-dollar industry, with thousands of registered lobbyists in Washington. Lobbyists utilize various methods to influence legislators, including promises of support, financial aid, and favorable publicity. Historical and modern lobbying tactics. Former Iowa Governor William Larrabee described historical lobbying tactics focused on exploiting individual weaknesses for corporate gain. Modern lobbying tactics have diversified and grown in power and influence. Powerful lobbying organizations. Schriftjesser and other American researchers highlight the significant influence of business organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in the American lobbying system. Role in political life. A commission investigating monopolies in the U.S. during the war emphasized the crucial role these capitalist organizations play in the country's political life, particularly through bodies like the National Industrial Council. Dominance by large corporations. The American Association of Manufacturers, though officially comprising about 16,000 entrepreneurs, is primarily controlled by 200 large corporations. The 12 wealthiest corporations are described as forming a supergovernmental body that dominates industry and politics. Influence tactics. Seldis and other researchers disclose that the association's headquarters, led by the Special Advisory Committee of 12 major corporations, employs various methods to exert influence, including espionage, use of strikebreakers, and drafting legislation for Congress. Lobbying beyond America. While lobbying is most developed in the U.S., it is also a common practice in other capitalist countries where monopolies exert influence over government agencies. Monopolies in government. Monopolies achieve control over the state by placing their agents in parliament and government positions, transforming from lobbyists to statesmen. Historical influence. The influence of monopolies on government composition and control of the state apparatus has been evident in U.S. history. State-level control. Monopolies like the Anaconda Copper Mining Company in Montana and J. Henry Rohraback in Connecticut have historically controlled political affairs and legislative processes in their respective states. Central government influence. Monopolists such as the DuPonts, Pews, Mellons, and Rockefellers have significant control over American political life, including Congress and the presidency. Presidential struggles. The American presidential system, with its significant executive powers, is a battleground for monopolistic cliques vying for influence over the presidential office. Literature on monopolistic influence. Books like 1,000 Americans by Seldes and The 60 Families of America by Ferdinand Landberg document the historical influence and control of American politics by monopolies, illustrating the power struggles among monopolistic groups. U.S. presidents and monopolies. According to Landberg, U.S. presidents are often seen as protégés and tools of monopolists. The ruling family's influence who enters the White House. President McKinley, 1896 to 1901, a protégé of the Rockefeller clique from Ohio, McKinley's presidency saw the rise of trusts and monopolistic associations, led by Rockefeller and Morgan. Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909. Roosevelt, Morgan's protégé, was perceived as a reformer but maintained policies favoring monopolies, using his radical rhetoric to quell public discontent. President Taft, 1909 to 1913, also linked to Rockefeller. Taft struggled to conceal his connections to financial elites. Trustification of production. Under McKinley, trusts flourished, covering nearly all production sectors. Rockefeller and Morgan led this movement. Theodore Roosevelt's policies. Roosevelt's antitrust rhetoric masked his service to monopolies, enriching the Morgan banking house. Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 1921, a protégé of Wall Street plutocrats. Wilson profited American monopolies through military supplies during his presidency. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover were seen as Standard Oil and Morgan puppets, adhering to the directives of financial elites. Monopolists in U.S. government. The influence of monopolists in the U.S. government is traced through cabinet compositions, starting with the Cleveland cabinets, which were linked to industrial capital. Pre-World War I period. Monopolies increasingly controlled local and federal government bodies. Prominent figures in McKinley's and Roosevelt's cabinets were connected to major monopolies like Rockefeller, Morgan, and Mellon. Monopolists preferred to remain in the shadows, using political emissaries and proxies in government and diplomatic roles. Role of lawyers. Many representatives of monopolies in politics were lawyers working for monopolistic interests. Senator Pettigrew and N. Rochester noted the significant influence of lawyers serving monopolistic interests in Congress and government. Impact of World War I. The war accelerated the integration of monopolists into the state apparatus. Businessmen from large corporations took part in managing special institutions created during the war. Post-war developments. Monopolists openly penetrated the state apparatus in the cabinets of Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Key government positions were filled by individuals associated with Wall Street and major financial interests. Diplomatic service. U.S. ambassadorial posts in key capitals were often filled by representatives of major financial groups. British Parliament pre-World War II. Many conservative MPs were directly tied to financial capital, holding significant shares and directorships in major industries. Monopolists often operated through family ties and proxies in Parliament. British government. Important ministerial and government positions were held by representatives of major monopolies. There was a common practice of businessmen rotating between government roles and corporate positions. Conclusion. There was a growing personal union between monopolies and governments, strengthening ties and direct penetration into state apparatuses. This process intensified during and after World War II, with finance capital securing strong positions in the central apparatus of imperialist states.